Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, then just pop along to patreon.com/the History Network and sign up to be a patron there. Thanks to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 34, episode 10. Eyewitness to War, Ammianus, Marcellinus, and the Siege of Amida, AD 359, Part 2. This episode was written by Murray Darm. Murray is an ancient and medieval military historian from New Zealand living in Australia. He has written more than 100 articles on various aspects of ancient and medieval military history, as well as other historical topics from all periods, ranging from the history of opera to the runic alphabet and recipients of the Victoria Cross. He is the author of Macedonian Phalangite versus Persian Warrior, Athenian Hoplite versus Spartan Hoplite, and Leuctra 371 BC, all from Osprey Publishing. He is a regular on the Ancient Warfare podcast, as well as a regular writer for us here. The legions of Magnentius and Decentius in Amida had been raised by the former usurper Magnentius, the general who usurped against Constantius in Gaul between 350 and 353, in his name and that of his brother. They were therefore a remnant of those disloyal troops, hence their stationing, a banishment, in the east. Their conduct at Amida would restore both their honour and reputation. The more familiar epithet of the 10th Legion was Fretensis or Fretenis of the Sea Strait, after a battle fought in 36 BC near the Strait of Messina. Although there is no need to doubt Ammianus's accuracy in ascribing this slightly different or additional epithet, Hortensis is later used the legion in the Notitia Dignitatum. The Superventoris and the Praeventoris may have been light cavalry or perhaps light infantry, since they are included with infantry legions listed here. There may also have been mixed auxiliary units. Several units of them are named in the Notitia Dignitatum. Ammianus adds that there were also in the town the greater part of the Comites Sagittarii, household archers. Ammianus therefore names 7 legions, and he does indeed reiterate that there were 7 legions present in the city. The exact status and numbers of some of the units he names are unclear, however. He gives the total population of the besieged city as 120,000. Certainly there were men from 3 legions, the 5th, 13th and 10th, as well as the usurper legions of Magnentius and Decentius. How strong these units would become important as the siege went on. The Persians immediately made an attack on the walls of Amida, but it was repulsed. Ammianus describes Shapur leading his troops in person at this point, but seems to describe a headdress, a diadem, a golden image of a ram's head set with precious stones, which was not Persian, but that of one of the Persians' allies. We see the headdress depicted on the coins of Kiddarite rulers, especially Peros, who ruled at this time, but he is not named directly by Ammianus as one of Shapur's allies. Soon after, Ammianus tells us of the cries of the Persians calling out San San and Pirosen, interpreted as King of Kings and Victor in Wars. Rather than cries to Shapur, however, these may have actually been the cry of Peroz's name, Shahanshah Peroz. This observation was made by Kodadad Rezakani, 2017, and it is entirely possible that Peroz was an ally of Shapur at this time. He was from the same area to the east of the Sasanian border as the other allies named the Albanians and Chionites, and Ammianus may have mistaken who was leading the troops at this moment. The attack on the next day was led by Grumbates, perhaps suggesting successive attacks by allies to prove their loyalty, and we are told that Shapur took part personally in an assault later, something he rarely did. So it seems unlikely that he would lead the first assault. Grumbates' assault was thrown into disarray when a ballista bolt from the walls killed his son. A fierce fight over the son's body took place and lasted until nightfall. His body was then burnt in accordance with Chionite practice, and it was decided that there should be 7 days of mourning. After that period of mourning, Grumbates declared that the city should be taken and burnt to propitiate the spirit of his son. The city was therefore placed under siege rather than taken by assault, which had so far been attempted. Ammianus tells us that it was surrounded by a 5-fold line of shields, and Persian horsemen filled every visible place around the city. The Chionites took up station where the son of their king had fallen. The Galani were on the south, the Albani on the north, and the Segestani, the bravest warriors, were on the western side. This is the first time the Gelani and the Segestani are named as allies in Shapur's army, so there were possibly other allies present too, such as the men of Peroz. With the Segestani were elephants. Ammianus seems to have had a particular distaste for the animals. Frightful, with their wrinkled bodies and loaded with armed men, a hideous spectacle, dreadful beyond every form of horror, as I have often declared. Inside the city, the defenders determined to die gloriously, since there seemed little hope of relief or rescue. Grumbates approached the wall and threw a blood-stained spear at the whole army, then swarmed to attack the walls, and the defenders manned them to repel the attackers. Ammianus's description is once again visceral. Then heads were shattered as masses of stone hurled from the scorpions crushed many of the enemy. Others were pierced by arrows, some were struck down by spear, and the ground strewn with their bodies, while others that were only wounded retreated in headlong fight to their companions. No less was the grief and no fewer the deaths in the city, whence a thick cloud of arrows in compact mass darkened the air, while the artillery, which the Persians had acquired from plunder of Singara, inflicted still more wounds. The defenders manned the walls in relays, but the loss of one to wound or death caused others of the defenders either to be knocked out of the way by their bodies or to take care of their companions' wounds. Ammianus continues, "Thus slaughter was piled upon slaughter, and prolonged to the very end of the day, nor was it lessened even by the darkness of evening. With such great determination did both sides fight." Fighting continued until dawn the following day, when, rather than being abandoned, it was joined afresh. The defenders continued bravely, but scarcely anyone could stand his ground without a wound. Fighting continued again until nightfall, and this time darkness brought rest. Ursicinus did attempt to relieve Amida, but was hampered by the inaction of Sabinianus, who refused to take action and risk the lives of his men. He claimed to have imperial instructions not to cause the death of any of his men. Nonetheless, Ursicinus was able to get scouts, exploratores, into the city, despite how difficult it was to do. Presence of 120,000 people crowded within the city soon brought challenges of another kind. Plague broke out, and Ammianus described the conditions in grisly detail. Within the city, where the quantity of corpses scattered through the streets was too great to admit of burial, a plague was added to so many ills, fostered by the contagious infection of maggot-infested bodies, the steaming heat and the weakness of the populace from various causes. The plague was ended rapidly, however, since on the night of the 10th day of the siege or of the plague outbreak, a light rain shower washed the city clean, and the contagion with it. The Persians now began to build shelters to protect troops from the missiles of the defenders. Towers were also constructed with iron cladding on the front to be brought against the walls. On top of each tower a ballista was placed, intended to keep the defenders on the walls from attacking the towers. The two Magnentian legions from Gaul were ill-suited to siege warfare, being used to open warfare on battlefields. They therefore chafed under the siege conditions and made reckless sallies from the walls. The only achievement of these sallies was a reduction in their own numbers. The men of these two legions were also not particularly useful in the construction of artillery or fortifications, and they were forbidden from making any further sallies, and so chafed even further under the confinement within the walls. Meanwhile, a deserter from the city led a small group of 70 elite Persian archers from the king's bodyguard through a series of subterranean passages which had been hollowed out under Amida into the cliffs facing the Tigris, the southern side. These passages had steps so that the occupants of the city could make their way down to the river for water and return again unobserved. Left unguarded because of their steepness, the Persian bowmen were led inside the city undetected and took up station in one of its towers. In the morning, the force of infiltrators signalled to the Persians outside the walls, and the battle was begun, with the Persians attacking from both sides and within the walls. The defenders were thrown into complete consternation for a time, but 5 ballistae were moved to cover the internal tower, and this measure quickly cleared it. The defenders then concentrated on the walls and the Persians attacking from without. The efforts of the defenders were increased because of their wrath at the actions of the deserter. With both attacks repulsed, the remainder of the day was spent in rest. The Persians were not concentrating solely on Amida. They had taken forts in their advance, and the following day the men of the fortress of Ziata, modern Harput or Harput, Turkey, 160 kilometers northwest of Amida, were brought into the enemy camp. Several other fortifications were taken and burned. The smoke from the fires was seen from the walls of Amida. The defenders witnessed thousands of prisoners, including women and old men, brought into the Persian camp and destined for slavery. This incensed the Magnentian Gallic troops, and they demanded that they were given opportunity to sally out against the enemy, even threatening their tribunes with death if permission was not granted. Permission was reluctantly granted, and the Gallic legionaries were instructed that if they broke through the Persian lines, they should continue on beyond them to freedom. On a gloomy and moonless night, the Gauls exited through a postern gate, armed with swords and axes. They rushed on the Persian camp violently and in close order. Killing the guards, they continued on, thinking they might even attack the Persian king's tent. The sounds of their victims dying, however, raised the alarm. The Gauls stood firm, shoulder to shoulder, as thousands of Persians, aroused from their sleep, rushed them. While the Gauls stood their ground, those Persians who came against them first were ill prepared to fight, unarmoured, and just woken, so they continued to take a heavy toll. When more and more Persians came against them, and these better prepared, the legions gave ground facing the enemy and withdrew back to the walls of Amida. The Gauls re-entered the city at daybreak, in diminished numbers, but with their reputation for bravery and loyalty too firmly re-established. Ammianus tells us that Constantius had statues of these men in full armour erected in a public spot in Edessa, and which were still standing when Ammianus wrote. This reward was surely in recognition for the loyalty these legions had shown, a sign they were now trusted. The threats against their own tribunes to allow the attack probably tells us that those men were not their own senior officers, but ones appointed after their involvement in the usurpation of Magnentius and Decentius and transfer to the east. Among the Sasanian victims of their sally were 4 nobles and satraps, senior Persian officers, over whom there was much wailing. A 3-day truce was agreed. The Persians then began to build siege engines in earnest, ironclad towers and penthouses to protect the heavily armoured troops as they advanced. Nonetheless, the attackers were so thick on the ground that the defenders' missiles rarely failed to find a mark. As evening approached, both sides rested. During the night, 4 scorpions, probably meaning onagers, were brought to oppose the ballistae on the Persian tower tops. When the attack was renewed in the morning, reinforced by elephants, the stones hurled by the scorpions managed to break the joists on the towers. The elephants were repulsed by surrounding them with firebrands. The Persian king himself then joined the thick of the battle like a common soldier. Ammianus tells us that Persian kings are never compelled to take part in battles. This once again suggests that the initial attack against Amida may have been led by Peroz rather than Shapur. In his finery he stood out, and many of the defenders targeted him and his attendants with their missiles. Only when many of his bodyguard had fallen did Shapur withdraw. Night brought a cessation of the fighting, but in the morning Shapur's wrath was still sharp. He ordered his men to raise mounds of earth above the city walls. The defenders countered with mounds of their own inside the walls. The crux of the siege occurred when one of the defenders' mounds collapsed forwards, and in doing so made a level causeway to the enemy mound above the height of the walls. Despite more defenders rushing to the spot, the Persians were sent in vast numbers with swords drawn, ready for hand-to-hand fighting. Carnage ensued, and bodies piled up, creating a further platform for the enemy to enter the city. And now the city was filled with the eager rush of the enemy's forces, and since all hope of defence or of flight was cut off, armed and unarmed alike, without distinction of sex, were slaughtered like so many cattle. As dark approached, the soldiers continued to fight. Ammianus tells us that he did with 2 others in a secluded part of the city, and under cover of the dark night made my escape through a postern gate at which no guard was kept. Although he does not tell us as much, this escape may have been a special mission assigned to Ammianus to get news of the city's fallout to any Roman force nearby. Through his knowledge of the surrounding terrain and countryside, and because of the speed of his companions, they were soon 10 miles from Amida. They eventually reached Melatina, or Melatene, in Lesser Armenia, modern Malatya, Turkey, some 200 kilometers northwest of Amida, a hazardous journey through enemy-occupied territory. There they found an unnamed Dux and his troop, Busem Tomitatumque, and accompanied them to Antioch, a further 360 kilometers southwest Malatya. Amida had suffered through a 73-day siege before falling to Shapur. It fell to him at the end of autumn. The leader of its defence, the Dux Alianus, and the remaining tribunes were executed. The other officers, as well as the paymasters, were led off into captivity. All Persian deserters were executed. The loss of Amida was, however, relatively inconsequential. Shapur had lost more men in taking it than he had captured, losing 30,000 men throughout the siege. The war would drag on and continue under Constantius' successor, Julian, who died on his Persian campaign in 363, a circumstance which would lead to a new peace, this one supremely advantageous to the Persians. And that is the end of season 34. Thanks, Murray, for writing that excellent episode for us. If you would like to write an episode for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org. And please do go along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork and become a patron there. Thanks again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. You've been listening to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast, written by Murray Darm, read by Nick Barker.